Ketzel Levine has been a perennial, although emerging in various hues and various seasons. After studies in music at Skidmore College and the New England Conservatory in Boston, Massachusetts, Levine's first radio job was programming at an NPR classical musical affiliate in Schenectady, New York. 3 years later, she headed for Washington, D.C. as an arts producer for NPR. In 1979, the year that NPR launched its morning edition, Miss Levine was made the network's first sports director, and as she points out, in a successful bid to impress her father, she brought out of retirement the baseball legend Red Barber into American homes each Friday morning with NPR host Bob Edwards. Over the next 3 years, she produced NPR's coverage of the Winter Olympics, as well as reporting from the Super Bowl, several World Series, and Wimbledon. Always a reluctant jock, she now claims she's forgotten everything she learned about sports. She moved to London in 1982 to expand her reporting repertoire. In addition to becoming the first American to broadcast baseball on BBC, she also worked out of the NPR's London bureau, filing regularly on European arts and culture. Despite her years in horticulture heaven, as she calls it, and her embarrassing proximity to some of the world's greatest gardens, Miss Levine claims that she managed to avoid learning anything about plants until returning to the States in 1985 as on NPR staff as their arts correspondent. Only then, when the stress of daily deadlines brought her to her senses, did she discover her passion for gardening. She followed her last story as an arts reporter in the winter of 1989 and has since immersed herself in the study of plants and a career writing and broadcasting about horticulture as NPR's gardening correspondent, the Doyenne of Dirt. And I think we've worked the dirt puns into the ground, so I promise not to pursue those. Ms. Levine's latest reincarnation has brought her to what she believes is her second shot at horticultural heaven in Portland, Oregon. She's been with us since April of this year. After 3 months among us, the recently transplanted Levine, shares her often quirky and idiosyncratic observations about the community at large in Portland, but particularly its world of horticulture and its community gardening movement. During the Rose Festival, she was bowled over by men in white suits handing out roses on street corners. And not to be outdone, and knowing your affection for AstroTurf, we have a rose for you. And it is a particularly luscious one. So I don't know where she's going to plant this particular rose, but with that introduction, I give you Ketzel Levine, the Pearl Mesta of penstemons. I'll put this out of your way. Yes.
Thank you very much. Let me get my ducks lined up here and get some water. Yes. Thanks. I am extremely surprised to be here today. You might say that many of my Portland friends are surprised I'm here also. What do you have to say to the City Club? They've been asking me in amazement for weeks. You're still driving around with out-of-state plates. And they're right. I have yet to pledge allegiance to the Centennial Prairie Schooner, but I will soon because there is no doubt that I am staying. There is no doubt at all. And on balance, yeah, perhaps this really isn't the best time for me to be addressing the City Club, particularly about my perceptions of a community I've known for a whopping 3 months, 1 week, and 2 days. But I don't think it's because I haven't been here long enough or haven't seen enough or have nothing to say. I have something to say. The reason my timing isn't great, and I mean this sincerely, is that I am hopelessly in love with Portland. It's not the landscape. I mean, sure, the mountain views. I love the mountain views. You'd think I was in pain for all the oying and oh my godding I am constantly doing. And I still gasp audibly to the constant chagrin of my companions when I turn a corner and see Mount Hood. I don't imagine that's likely to change too soon. It does seem inconceivable to me that I too will adjust to its presence as I make my mundane way up and down I-5. It's not the Japanese gardens that have clinched my love affair with Portland, or the Hoyt Arboretum, or the Bishop's Close, or the Leach, or the Berry Botanic Gardens. Admittedly, I did get pretty weak-kneed for 15 minutes in April when the sun came out and kissed me at the Crystal Springs Rhododendron Garden. But that was just a flirtation, that was not the real thing. Don't get me wrong, every one of these places has impressed me. What's not to be impressed? Even my poor dogs are suffering from the embarrassment of riches that is Portland's green space. Mount Tabor today? I don't know. What about Laurelhurst? Hey, I know, let's head north and surf the scum at Kelly Point Park. We're all pretty happy here. But what makes me pant in particular comes as a complete surprise. I am irrational about the view west from Interstate Avenue. I look out over the railroad yards and my heart breaks with longing. For what? I have no idea. I think a lot of it is the light, the way the light plays with the city. I swear sometimes I feel like I'm intruding on an intimacy I wasn't meant to see. This week alone, I felt what I can only describe as jealousy as I watched in awe at the way sunrise was waking and warming and revealing itself to the burnished, blushing Broadway bridge. It's a lot to take in. And while I do believe this is a very beautiful city, I am not undone by its setting or its scope or skyline. I understand you hear this quite often about Portland, but if I might lift my voice to the chorus, it's the scale of this place that kills me. It is so vulnerable. It is so human. I am so unused to a place that actually surrounds and succumbs and reveals itself. And I imagine that's why running even the most expedient errand over the Fremont Bridge at sunset can cause my throat to tighten and make me want to cry. I suspect you're finding my passion for this place maybe flattering, a little innocent, even endearing. Generally, people in love often are. But in a very real sense, while I'm in the grips of this infatuation, I believe I am a less valuable citizen and correspondent than I someday hope to be. I borrow my reasoning from the writings of therapist and philosopher Irving Yalom, whose book Love's Executioner has kept me grounded for years as I've continued to be caught off guard in manners of madness and love. The reason I have less to offer as a member of the community is because I am temporarily blinded by what I need Portland to be. I have to tell you, I came here wanting a great deal from this city. I came here starved for a sense of place, a place where I could belong. Some of you may know that I moved here from Washington, D.C., and I guess that would at least suggest the degree of my deprivation. You want to talk about scale, I grant you, it's fun to be a tourist, but the human scale is way out of whack in Washington. Inspiring as it may be to look up at a mile-high behemoth of a once very famous man, the grandiosity of the place makes mincemeat out of us Jims and Janes. And the buildings are bad enough before you start to consider the people inside the buildings. Grandiosity in the nation's capital is not just endemic, it is indeed epidemic. So it comes naturally in DC, this feeling that you don't matter to the place in which you live, that you cannot make a dent, let alone a difference. In time, you cease having a stake in what happens around you. You become less accountable. You tear off a piece of whatever you can get, drag it back to the den, congratulate yourself on providing for you and yours in an impossibly hostile environment. Do you think maybe I did the right thing by leaving? But I picked the nation's capital as a place to live for reasons that were entirely humble and honorable. I arrived in 1977 to work for National Public Radio. For 5 gorgeous years, to be followed by 15 good to fair to middling ones, I had the great fortune to be an integral part of an exciting new venture, an emerging and unprecedented non-commercial radio network that believed in, get this, creative freedom and valued, I kid you not, the voice of the people. I worked in a highly charged community of 20 and 30-somethings who were too young to want families, but needed desperately to matter, and who found reason and solace and excitement and passion in their work in non-commercial broadcasting. I single those 5 years out because though I am still happily affiliated with NPR, those were the years of community. Those were the years of belonging. The early days of Morning Edition, this is 79 now, felt like living in a football huddle, an intense conspiracy of teammates with a clear goal and the muscle and grit to get there. We called them the Mankiewicz years. Imagine, if you will, the untried territory and the bottomless terror of creating a live 2-hour morning news program without a name or an identity or even a measurable audience. We were under the gun big time. Support within NPR was even shaky. Our beloved colleagues over at All Things Considered regarded us with contempt and pity. Pity because it was really unfair that we were expected to duplicate their soaring successes. Contempt because there was always the chance that we just might. Of course, there was also this small matter of a voice, a stable presence, you know, what they call a host. Well, it seems inconceivable today, but when Morning Edition premiered, it did not star Bob Edwards. Instead, the show went on driven by fear. After all, when an organization is in the grips of self-doubt and self-scrutiny, after creating outrageous and unrealistic expectations about a non-existent program, why turn to tried and true in-house talent when you can bring in outsiders who know nothing about what you do? So the show devoured a few hosts before Bob was made a reasonable offer and successfully lured away from co-hosting All Things Considered. Once things settled down, it was generally agreed that we'd weathered the worst of it. Morning Edition was the new kid on the block, and the kid whistling theme music by B.J. Liederman was here to stay. Incidentally, if I cherish any memories of the early days more highly than others, it's got to be sitting in producer Jay Kernis's office, sheet music in our hands, listening to take after take after take of BJ's music right after it came out of the studio being recorded. Leadered up on the tape machine were at least 1 million synthesized arrangements of that dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun tune, the now popular, irrepressibly upbeat version, and the plaintive call of the oboe, and what was my favorite, the now defunct sports roll. But at the time, for Jay Kernis, mastermind of Morning Edition, these weren't just little jingles or buttons or fillers. This was art. This was Broadway. And though I do get the credit for bringing Red Barber out of retirement, which I'm certain is why God made me, it was Jay Kernis who had the flair to choose a woman with a crush on a Yankee catcher to be MVP as sports director for Morning Edition. That was my only qualification for the job. It was Thurman Munson, by the way. I don't know if there are any Yankee fans in here, but I'm not as romantic as I once was about baseball. You file a few stories from the Yankees locker room and the romance fades pretty fast. But like most kids, I grew up believing that baseball was about belonging, about earning and defending a sense of place. My folks are both from Brooklyn. My father was weaned on the Brooklyn Dodgers. His home away from home was Ebbets Field, and he snuck in there regularly without ever leaving home, wrapped in the voice of Red Barber. So it wasn't surprising that when I was asked to come up with a regular baseball commentator, my very being led me directly to Red Barber's door. He was then barely 70 and a firecracker of a guy, his hair still arguably red. I wanted Red Barber to come out of retirement in the worst kind of way because I wanted to do it for my dad. Incidentally, it would be more than a year before my dad and Red met, never in person but on the telephone. It was my parents' 40th wedding anniversary. Red called and took my dad by complete surprise. I'd never really seen the boy in my father before, and it was a gift, one of many from Red. Well, as you know, Red's Friday morning chats with Colonel Bob became the mainstay of Morning Edition. Red never could get over his good fortune to have come back off the bench and become, again, a star. My years of friendship with Red and Lila Barber, because of NPR, were intense, warm, and wonderful. The two of them slipped effortlessly into my life. the grandparents in Florida. Red was resolutely old-fashioned and not very open-minded. He was extravagantly supportive of me when he approved of what I did, and he came down really hard on me when he didn't. Bear in mind, I was in my late 20s, so I guess I was fair game for a grandparent. My own folks could never have gotten away with talking to me that way. I have very few of my possessions with me here in Portland. Everything's still back east, but I did bring Red's letters. I'd like to read you a couple of precious moments from a letter dated June 1st, 1982, written to me by Red while I was living in London. This is where I would like to bring his voice in and have him read over me, but alas, he's no longer with us. Dear Ketzel, you were very sweet to telephone Lila on Mother's Day. She was thrilled, got tears in her brown eyes. Lila's been in bed for a week and has to stay there another week at least. This means the little cat and I are keeping house, kitchen, and yard. You see, Ketzel, there are times a husband is useful as well as ornamental. Keep this in mind. Summer has arrived, as it always does in Tallahassee, hot, humid, muggy, with showers. No one place has everything, and every one has an equation of pluses and minuses. Remember this, my dear. You have a great opportunity to really see and know London now, Ketzel. Don't blow it. Your Friday morning edition discovery, Red. Red approved of my career move to London, but he was really over the moon when I hooked up with a guy. He was always making references to the Gene Austen song, Look Down That Lonesome Road. The song is about life, he wrote, and how it becomes increasingly a lonely route when you're going it alone. His handwriting leaps off the page a year later after he hears that my partner and I have bought a house, he writes. I congratulate you on this evidence of stability and serious purpose. When I left the house and the partner, Red was none too pleased with me. And he started in again with that Gene Austen song. Well, with the City Club as my witness, I am here to tell you, Red, you were right. Life is harder, life is lonelier alone. I'm working on it, Red, but I don't think it's just about a partner. It's about a place, and it's about a community. And once upon a time, it was about NPR. By 1982, though, the emerging days of NPR were just about over. The network had arrived. Many of us on staff arrived, too, in our own ways, and developed appetites for more vainglorious goals. It was pretty much about that time that the first NPR reporters started showing up on network television, if you remember. And I, for one, a pishgala, a whippersnapper, even by NPR standards, gave up producing behind the scenes in Washington for a chance to report from London. Ironically, the more I came into my own as a reporter, the less I felt a part of the whole. I guess that's pretty much the definition of growing up, rejecting the boundaries of the family for the boundary-less possibilities of the self. But still, like a young adult who keeps coming back to check the water and test those boundaries, figuring everything will be pretty much the way she left it since parents don't change. I have to say I was caught off guard when I returned to 2025 M Street after my 5 years away. I was caught off guard because I'd underestimated just how much NPR had changed, too. Old friends though we were, we did not embrace when I returned. Instead, the network and I got lawyers, bickered over expectations, and finally signed a contract for a job. The community of discovery of cozy rooms, rugs, and wall hangings I'd been a part of in the 70s and 80s had become an organization of gray flanneled modules and efficiently organized space. I didn't like the change much. Red might have, though, evidence of stability and serious purpose. But it was a change that had to happen for the good of the network and ultimately for me. The new NPR hastened my departure. I needed to get out of there for a while. It seemed a pretty retro career decision at the time. I was 36 and theoretically just hitting my stride, but I wanted off the fast track. I needed solitude. I discovered gardening. One of the oft-quoted sayings about gardening is attributed to Thomas Jefferson. Though I am an old man, I am but a young gardener. My own bastardized version of that thought might be, just because I garden doesn't mean I know a damn thing about life. It's a leap of faith, but bear with me. I think the most fundamental thing about gardening is this: plants must be in the right place in order to thrive. That doesn't mean the place where we want them to be, or where the designer draws them on the plan, or even where the book tells you to put them. By the way, that's something you hear ad nauseum in horticultural seminars. Plants don't read. What they do, if you will, is act out their genetic inclinations. And our job as gardeners is to understand these inclinations, to understand the culture of the plant. Light exposure, for instance, is a cultural need, sun versus shade. So is rich versus rotten, thin soil. A tolerance for attention is a cultural need. Some plants like spoiling, others thrive on neglect. Does a plant prefer to be crowded? Does it resent being disturbed? Would a sea breeze do? No. How about an alpine meadow? The point is, a good gardener does not ask a plant to be something it isn't. Instead, he or she works with what is, without judgment. Put it here, and if it fails to thrive, put it there. So like I said, just because I garden doesn't mean I know a damn thing about life. Which brings us to the difference between thriving and surviving. I was surviving just fine in Washington, D.C., thanks very much. I'd clawed a nice chunk out for myself. After I resigned as NPR's arts reporter in December of 1989, I became a professional gardener, and for 6 years, as owner of Hortis Landscaping, I kept myself in the style to which my ex-husband had helped me grow accustomed. I owned a gorgeous Victorian home on a double lot with a magnificent garden, which, by the way, I cannot sell, and if you would like to see me after the meeting to talk about a commission, I'm available. I paid taxes, I voted, I gave to the food bank and the AIDS clinic and the women's shelter. I wasn't living under a rock. I had a life. But despite the veneer of connectedness, I lived in relative apathy. Apathy is the opposite of community. I lived defensively. I just wanted to keep what was mine. I didn't know what I was missing. I mean, how could I know? Yeah, I had those years of intense connectedness at NPR, but I knew that wasn't the real world. And the experience of living outside of community, however voluntary, without a spouse, without children, however voluntary, is a profoundly lonely experience. Red Barber knew that. And even if you can't spell out what's missing, it's hard not to know there's a problem. But I was from DC, the land of the grandiose and the egomaniacal, so I figured the problem was personal and not a problem of place. Then, 2 years ago, a fellow plant nerd and I came out to vacation in the Pacific Northwest. We were faint half the time from hyperventilating over the wonders that are the plants and gardens and nurseries of the Northwest. On that trip to Seattle and Vancouver, I hadn't heard of Portland then. It's a joke. It's a joke. It's a joke. On that trip, I had a plant epiphany. I saw the same plants I was killing back east absolutely thriving in the Northwest. I couldn't believe they were the same plants. It was as if they were on steroids. I got dizzy, I got greedy, and I wanted my plants to grow that way. A year passed before it fully dawned on me that what we had here was one of them life metaphors. That it wasn't just my Carex flagellifera that was failing to thrive. It was me. Once that synapse fired, my mind exploded with the possibilities of what might become of me if I myself was planted in the right place. Duh. I looked into Seattle, and all roads led to Portland. I looked into Portland, just knocked on the door, really, and the damn place hugged me and called me by my first name. So I'm here now, and I am in love with Portland. But I have been taking notes, and I see what's at risk, and I recognize there's a great deal here that we cannot afford to lose. It scares me when people say that Seattle used to feel like Portland. Really scares me. The implication being that as Portland expands to accommodate the likes of me, that it will end up feeling like Seattle. Optimistic friends assure me that the urban growth boundary and the dedicated green spaces provide us with a foolproof infrastructure. Well, I hate to say it, but already I've noticed a crack. If you'll allow me one small agenda item, I've seen enough to notice this. The 11 begged and borrowed acres that are the community gardens of Portland will disappear the instant someone with money and muscle wants to build on that land. Just thought I'd point that out while I had your attention. It's an agenda item I hope to talk a whole lot more about in the future. You see, I live in Portland now. I have a stake in what happens here. It's not just endemic, it's downright epidemic. Poof, you're accountable. That's Portland. So, I'd like to wrap this baby up with a portrait of my new hometown captured by Portland's own Andrea Carlisle in her book, The River House Stories, How Pooh-Bah S. Queen and Lazy LaRue Saved the World. When we meet Pooh-Bah and Lazy, they've just discovered that their houseboat is facing the wrong direction, and the neighbors have offered to turn it around. Lazy didn't even try to imagine how they would do it. She went to the store in the morning and bought lots of chips and cheese and crackers and beer. Then she waited. Plenty of neighbors came. They arrived in motorboats and on foot. They brought long hooked poles and ropes as big around as telephone poles. "This'll be easy," their neighbor Dugan told them. His wife Sal stood next to him and nodded. "Easier than you think," she assured them. The neighbors tied the ropes to the corner of the river house and then to the motorboats. They unhooked the chains holding the house to the walkway and then shouted, "Ho!" The motorboat drivers started their motors and moved downriver. Slowly, the long house swung out from the walkway. "Not too far," Sal called to the motorboats. They all called to one another. "There, whoa! Now, throw that in. Hey, give me that. Stop! Easy. Good. Yes, good," Lazy said in a small voice from the walkway. "Real good." She watched them pull the house around so that the front window faced exactly onto the river. The whole event took only an hour. The neighbors chained the house up again from the back end to the walkway. "There you go," the neighbor said. "There you go," they told Pooh-Bah and Lazy, who then offered them the beer and chips and cheese and crackers. Lazy wished she could have given them flowers and lobsters and the finest wines. The small boats motored up to the walkway, and the people in them drank the beer and smiled. "Like that better?" Lazy and Pooh-Bah rushed inside. Now they could see not only the river, but the tree-lined shore opposite the river houses and the bridge in the distance and downriver as well. They invited the neighbors to come inside. Dugan and Sal and Charlie and the others stepped in and looked admiringly out at the water. "That's better," they said quietly and nodded, then slowly wandered back to their own houses, beer in hand. Pooh-Bah and Lazy spoke with adoration of them for the rest of the day and the next and the one after that. "I like river life," Lazy admitted for the first time out loud. "The best thing about it is the people." Thank you, people. Thank you, Portland.
And thank you, Ketzel. I'm Greg Jackson, the chair of the program committee. It's my pleasure to ask the first question. And then for those of you who are City Club members, please come up to the microphone here and you get a chance to ask all those gardening questions of Ketzel.
You knew what you were going to ask me before and you didn't give me time to prepare?
That's right. You're a radio pro. What I really want to ask you is how you keep your fingernails clean from all that dirt, but I'll ask you that afterwards. You're talking about gardening as a metaphor for life, and on Monday mornings after the weekend at work, we talk a lot about what people did over the weekend, and a lot of people I work with are gardeners. They love to garden, and when people talk about gardening, their eyes glaze over and they go somewhere else. It's a connection to the divine. I'm sure many of you know what I'm talking about. It's almost a spiritual moment when people are gardening. So I'd like to know your reflections on gardening and its connection to spirituality.
Yes, there is one. Is this a serious question, honestly? What can I tell you? I guess I don't really differentiate between the two. I mean, I don't think about God when I garden. I don't really think about my place in the universe when I garden, but clearly, because I am gardening, I have a place. Again, I belong. I am out of myself, and maybe that's what the spirituality to gardening is. When you truly lose yourself in what it is that you're doing, whether it's gardening or anything, you know, you become elevated. You cease, you overcome, as I say, the boundaries of who we are. And I guess that's why I took up gardening, although I'm a bit of a cynic, so I would never have admitted that right out. But after my journey, which I've described to you, you could argue that spirituality was at a low in my life. And that may very, very well be why it was that I was attracted to gardening and to the egolessness of it. Now, I'm not saying it's an egoless pursuit, because we are maniacs, and we are driven, and we are highly competitive. But at a certain level, you have no control over what you're doing. You have absolutely no control. Control is illusion. And when you understand that, when you understand that anything that you achieve is temporal, garden's going to change, plant's going to die, leaves are going to drop, it's humbling. It's an important place to remember where you belong. Any easy questions?
I'm Mona Ozaki, City Club member. Here's an easy question. Tell me why it's important that we have community gardens.
From what I saw, and from what I see of what's happening here, the community gardens are perhaps one of the last places left where people can garden together. I mean, I'm a pretty selfish gardener. I like to have my own space. I right now have no space and have no garden. But when I do, I don't necessarily want to spend my time with other people, but there comes a point where I need people around me in my garden, working with me in the garden, to help me connect. So, okay, I go to Portland Nursery and I buy plants, and I go here and I support this business and that business, and I am part of the community as I garden. But a community garden is perhaps the only place where people get to be alone and separate and together, where they get to share about something as absolutely neutral, non-political, non-denominational as gardening, where they get to share food, where they get to share seeds, where if you are alone, and so many of us are alone, you get to leave the confines of your own space and belong and go and do. You don't have to exercise and you don't have to join a club. Being there is enough to belong. And I think that community gardens offer that. I think community gardens offer people who don't have the luxury of their own homes a place to establish themselves, a place to express themselves. And for those of us who cannot escape on weekends and do not have country homes and do not experience all of these kinds of luxuries, a community garden is a place to get away in a different way than a park is a way to get away, because in a community garden you continue to be able to leave your print, to make yourself known, to establish that you're here and that you matter. Park is a great place, there's no doubt about it, but a park is not putting your hands in the dirt, making something happen that someone else can experience and that you can go back and experience again. And I have not seen many community gardens in many cities until I came to Portland for the first time to see the community gardens in particular. And let me tell you that they offer something and are only beginning to offer what they could. I think that there are people who are not involved in the community garden movement because they have their own space and don't need it, that are perhaps missing what a community garden could do. The other thing I noticed was that a lot of food is getting distributed out of the gardens to the community, to the neighborhoods where it's needed. Well, no, you just can't top that. You got a long haul, you must be serious.
Hi, Connie Van Dyke, City Club member. I was wondering if you could tell us how it works. I'm going to be moving to a new area and I'd like to start a community garden. And I know you've just moved in this neighborhood, so you may not know the legalities of it, but just the concept of how it works, where the water comes from, how to get the property, that sort of thing.
I can't address that. There are people in the city who can. Leslie Polkosbow is the first that comes to mind, and Carol Boutard. If I have time, can I bring up one of the experts in community gardening? Carol, would you join us? Please. So the question to you is, how do you start a community garden? Go for it, girl.
How are you? I'm Carol Boutard. I am co-chair of the Friends of Portland Community Gardens, which is an organization that helps promote community gardening and education, garden education, year-round in Portland. Starting a community garden in Portland or in any area requires certain guidelines that we've developed that really help you create something that lasts for a very long time, which is our intent. The person to get in touch with in Portland is Leslie Polkosbow. She's the director of the Portland Community Gardens program. 823-1612. She's going to kill me, but give her a home phone number for $10. But anyway, do ask her because there's some very simple guidelines. We have an enormous waiting list right now for plots, but we've just opened, thanks to Portland and a lot of strong neighborhood support, a new garden in the Brentwood-Darlington neighborhood in Southwest Portland. So there is some room. So give her a call.
Thank you, Carol. Before she leaves, is there any more community gardening questions? Okay, you're off the hook, girl. Anything else? Yes.
Hi, my name's Darrell Hartnett, and I too moved from Washington, D.C. this year.
Did you?
And I too cannot sell my house in DuPont Circle.
We got to talk.
But I loved the gardens of Washington. I really got involved in gardens just by going to the gardens. And one of the gardens, and I'm just learning to find the gardens in Portland, but is there any gardens in Portland that you found that are anything like the water lily gardens in D.C.? You know, the gardens
aquatic gardens.
Yeah.
I see them integrated into various gardens. I don't know if there is an aquatic garden per se. There are gardeners in here. Is there an aquatic garden? No. Well, there's room for expansion. Did you go early in the morning? Is that when you used to go over to that garden? Because
just at different times.
different times?
Yeah, it was always such a lonely place.
It's a very dicey neighborhood.
Yeah.
It's a very dicey neighborhood. I think you're one of 8 people in all of Washington, D.C. to go to the Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens. Good for you.
Fran Storrs, City Club member. My gardening father felt that gardeners were not depressed because they could never wait for the next spring, and as a gardener, I think I can certify that. Tell us about some of the plants that you've noticed that do indeed thrive in this part of the country that do better here than in other places, and that are some of your favorites.
You know, you'd think I would have prepared for a question like that. I don't know if you're into carex. Are you into carex? Are you into sedges? I was only half kidding about Carex flagellifera. I really am astonished by what Carex, which is a sedge, which is a very unsexy plant. You grow it for its foliage. What they do out here. You can maintain color out here that you can't maintain in other parts of the country because of the heat and the humidity or the cold. So what you get in the Carexes and in your phormiums and in all of these plants are oranges and purples and depths of hues that you cannot get in other parts of the country. And so I, for one, when I have a garden, intend to really push color. The chartreuses, the burgundies, the blues, even something as simple as Rosa glauca, which is a beautiful small rose. I mean, the rose is secondary to the foliage, but again, this is something that I will tend towards. Here, it's this opalescent blue foliage. It's really very spectacular, and it can be a huge, abundant shrub. And at home, it sort of winds along, and it's okay. It's not going to die. It doesn't really want to be there. And there's an exuberance that happens to that particular rose out here. And I think that that's what I find over and over again. Very ordinary plants, even geraniums. I mean, geraniums, hardy geraniums, they did fine in Washington, but they do not get mammoth like they do here, knee-high like they do here. And the same is true for, Hebes I could never grow, so that would be something that I'd want to jump right into. Eucalyptus I could never grow, I would jump right into that. Arbutus, a lot of the shrubs, the ceanothus, I couldn't grow any of the ceanothus, and that's pretty exciting stuff to do. And I think of just much more ordinary plants. I'm looking it in my mind, and I can't quite come up with the name of it. I'll have to let that one go. I better let it go immediately, or else there'll be a long pregnant pause. Again, I think, actually, I do have something that I'd like to share with you about that, and that is that, as I've said ad nauseum, I don't have a garden, but I have a wonderful roommate who has let me play in her garden. And I'm like starting from scratch, and I'm not starting from scratch because I don't have my plant vocabulary. I'm starting from scratch because I don't have a clue what things will do here. I am seeing mixed metaphors everywhere that make me absolutely crazy. At Carol Boutard's garden outside, what do you have? You have hellebores growing next to roses. I mean, this is an obscenity to me. Maybe you don't get this, but a full shade, damp loving, woodsy plant with a full sun loving. So what I'm finding is that I'm throwing away everything I knew, and I'm throwing things together that I never would have considered throwing together before, because there's a good chance that maybe it'll work here. So I guess what I would say, more than just the plants in particular, which I would love to talk more about and write more about, is that this is a place to garden where you can chuck assumptions. You can just chuck your assumptions. You can just throw the shade-loving and the sun-loving, even the water-loving and the drought-loving, because it's a phenomenal kitchen where the climate just seems to be absolutely appropriate for madness, for all sorts of strangeness. And I would encourage people to experiment, because you don't know what it's like to be someplace where you can't grow so many of these things. The very fact that you can is unfair and obscene. And that's what this climate has to offer me. And there are plants that I miss. I'm not going to lie, there are definitely plants that I miss. I'll go into that some other time too when I have my list. But in the meantime, I think that the possibilities are terrifyingly limitless here. And I encourage you all to play and play and play. Yes.
Hi, Sonny Russell, City Club member. Woo. I'm going to ask you a non-gardening question.
Thank you.
Apparently, you have the same connection with your father that Doris Goodwin described when she was here for Portland Arts and Lectures. And do you ever get together and discuss baseball with other women baseball fans?
Never. Do you know any? I could put a little group together. No, I never do. I never do. I learned about sports because I had to learn about sports. I mean, I guess this is as good a time as any to sort of give away one of my worst secrets, and I promise not to give away yours. When Jay Kernis hired me for this job as sports director, really all I did have was a crush on Thurman Munson. And these were the days of the Yankees when it was also Bucky Dent and Lou Piniella. I mean, there were some really nice-looking guys on this team, and I went for the short, fat, squat catcher. I'm not sure what it was. It really captured my imagination. And that was it. That was it. And Kernis says, we need somebody with an art sensibility to really, upgrade what NPR sports coverage is, because there was no NPR sports coverage. I used to sit by the telephone with a pad And people would call in from all over the country, from OPB and from KLCC and from Seattle and from Denver and Chicago and Florida. And they'd call in and they'd say, hey, how about a story about the bears? And I'd write down, bears. They'd say, how about a story about the bucks? And I'd write down, bucks. and on and on and on. And I had one confidant who, God bless him, is dead now. I had one confidant who I would call at the end of the day and I would say, what is a buck? What is a bullet? What, you know, a redskin? Is this a joke? So in answer to your question, no, I didn't recreationally get together to talk about sports, although I really did turn into a major jock during those few years and really have forgotten absolutely everything that I learned.
Hi, Krista Swan, City Club member. Ketzel, could you expound a little on what you mean by a sense of place?
Oh, boy, I thought I did. I got 4,000 words here on a sense of place. Well, for me, I guess a sense of place is one where I matter. I think that's part one. And a place that reflects back maybe my values, maybe my expectations, maybe my goals. When I talk about not having found a sense of place in Washington, there's some things that I haven't talked about, and some of that involves choosing to be single, choosing not to have children, and living in an environment where this was strange. So a sense of place, a sense of community is I hesitate saying like-minded because like-minded isn't quite it. But where my choices are not defaults by other people's standards. And I think that a lot of what was wrong with my life on the East Coast is that my choices looked like runner-up decisions for life. You're laughing. Does this surprise you? And I think a sense of place is one where there's room for me. You know, there's room for my choice, where my choice holds equal value. And when you're talking about an established town like Washington, D.C., it's very hard. I mean, unless you are actively on the fringes and you're aggressively on the fringes, which I was not. I'm not an activist, and I didn't have a drum to beat. You know, I just didn't. It matters to feel that you're valid, and I think that that's probably what a sense of place and a sense of community is. And I don't know why it is that suddenly I care what happens in Portland. You know, I don't know why it is that suddenly I really do feel like I have a stake. And maybe it's because of the scale. Maybe it's as simple as that. I don't deny that there are thousands and thousands of wonderful, committed, and fabulous people in all of the major big cities in the country who can work their way through red tape and establishments and matter and make things change and feel that they matter. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And I guess there's enough special interest here. There's enough attention to detail here. There's enough advocacy for the alternative and for the little person, you know, the Jims and Janes, that we're valid. Our agenda is valid. What we want is valid and doesn't have to take a backseat to anybody. And that's a sense of place.
I'm Sally Gould, a City Club member, and I have a question. We have a controversy in our city as to have a parking garage 14 stories high or a park and maybe a garden.
You want me to vote? Or
coming from the East Coast, what would attract you to cities such as Portland? Would you come here to see the beauty of a 14-story park? I mean, a garage? Or would you prefer a beautiful garden that would attract people to shop?
Let me guess. There is a right answer, yeah? Well, exactly. Exactly. I've heard stories like this. You know, when I went to the community gardens, I heard about how something was perilously close to being turned into a dormitory property. I've also heard about community gardens that got perilously close and they disappeared. It's over. I'm not going to address the parking garage thing because, you know, that sort of looks pretty black and white to me, and I don't know anything about it. I'll vote, you know, I'll definitely vote if you want me to. But, you know, what I am looking to the city mothers and fathers for in this town is an example of how it's done right. You know, I talk about unrealistic expectations when Morning Edition went on the air, right? You know, that here was this behemoth and nobody knew what it was going to be, but the network sort of had an entire country ready to take a morning news program. Unrealistic expectations, but ultimately, you know, we pulled through. Well, maybe my expectations of Portland are unrealistic at this point. What I am looking for is an example of how it's done right. And I don't know if it's just self-congratulatory, and that's why I hear that Portland is a place where things are done right, where planning is taken seriously, where people are looking ahead, where the scope of agendas are taken into consideration. I don't know if that's true. I pray it is. That is what I'm looking for here. And I guess a balance, sophisticated, caring, thoughtful, committed citizens look at the balance and look at the way in which you park cars and have parks. I don't pretend you're not going to have to park the cars. And I don't pretend that Portland isn't going to have to cope with absolutely everything that Seattle, which I have maligned greatly, and I apologize, but I don't like Seattle, and I don't like what happened in Seattle. And my hope and my expectation, and maybe my role too, is to be a part of why this place remains different. Because right now, there ain't a whole lot like it in the country. This much I know. Yes?
I'm Judy Miller. I'm the guest of the City Club member Susan Descamp. And I have a little business called Madam Butterfly House and Garden Reconstruction.
I've seen you. You're right off of Martin Luther King.
Right. I work in the inner city, in inner north and northeast, because that's where the houses are affordable, and I buy them to fix up and resell. And what I want to comment is the articles I've been reading lately about, first of all, the wonderful article yesterday about Martin Luther King Boulevard and how it's coming back. And the articles about the urban growth boundary and how we don't want to expand it. And also, I read an article, an interesting one, about healing gardens and how gardens are being put into hospitals and hospices and retirement homes to give people that chance to, you know, experience what gardening can do. I wonder if you would comment, Ketzel, on the chance Portland has to do it right as we redevelop the inner city rather than letting it become another Detroit or Washington, D.C., and the importance of putting, you know, green spaces, little plazas, little areas where people can be with nature so that we don't turn into a cement jungle. It's a chance that I see that almost no other city has ever had because the time is right and the enthusiasm is there, and we've got this opportunity. Could you comment?
You just did. I mean, you just said everything that I could possibly say. You're in the position to know who the people are who can make that happen. I don't know who those people are. I don't know where those decisions are made. I don't know where you need the muscle to make sure that things happen in that way. But there's no question that that's a part of why I'm here, because that's it. It is possible. I mean, the very fact that you're talking about having that chance is what sets this place apart, that the chance still exists. I mean, I don't mean to sound like this is some frontier, but I do feel that people are looking at this place and saying, okay, it's going to change, we're going to change, how are we going to do it? We're not going to let it happen to us. How are we going to do it? And maybe other places don't have the opportunity to do that. Maybe, although, come to think of it, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't it here in the 70s that you pulled out an existing freeway along the river to make, I mean, that's Portland, you know? The priorities are such that something as absurd, you know, I mean, the idea of being able to put forth an agenda in New York to pull out an existing freeway along a waterfront to make it a green space, So you already got a leg up on the ladder because there's already the attitude here. How you do that, where you do that, you know, where you sign on the dotted line to make sure that that property is protected is your work, my work. And if you know, let me know, because this is something I would like to know. Yes?
Gregson Parker, member. Welcome to Eden. We need more gardeners and we need more poets, and you obviously fill both bills. I'd like to give you an opportunity to pitch your business. Are you doing landscaping here? If so, what do you do? What do you not do? How do we reach you? How do we hire you? Tell us.
Thank you. The spirit and volunteerism in this town is a little much sometimes, you know. I do have a garden consulting business. It's called Doyenne for a Day. And I am available to come and consult for as little as an hour or two, or to spend the day with you, especially gardeners who are active and really would like, some of what we're talking about being able to get in a community garden, would like the input of another professional who can look at what you have, assess it. I also have the possibilities of taking my clients shopping and getting them wholesale, which is something I also like to do, because on the East Coast we don't like to pay retail. And I will be doing that. Also, coming up in the future will be a radio program on Oregon Public Broadcasting. Unclear when that's going to happen. Hopefully we'll be launching it in the fall. And its theoretical name, just like Once Upon a Time there was a morning edition, this one may turn out to be the Weekend Dirt. So I would ask you all to listen out for that. Doyenne for a Day, let's see, how do you reach me? Well, I actually don't have a phone listing yet. I would recommend that you reach me through OPB. And if you're on email, I'm at ketzel@teleport.com, which I think some of you might be familiar with. And you can also reach me through another landscaping business, which is run by a friend of mine who has kindly rented out the 3rd floor of their house to me, where I use as an office. I say rented, that's a euphemism. They haven't rented it to me. They're sharing it with me. And his business, which is also a brilliant business, is Sistus Design, CISTUS. So you can reach me through Sistus Design as well. Thank you for asking.
Ketzel, thank you. We look forward to seeing how you go about establishing your roots here. The community is still close enough that you realize we're expecting you to invite us all over to see your garden once you get it going. And in the meantime, don't forget your rose. And we are adjourned. See you next Friday.